Sometimes the things we judge as worthless hold far more value than we'll ever know. And sometimes pride can blind us to what stands right before us. In the frontier town of Mercy Gulch, wealthy widow Eleanor Blackstone laughed at Jesse Cole and his old donkey. She believed real ranchers rode fine horses. Jesse didn't argue. He simply entered the town's annual Stockman's Challenge, a test of true grit and wisdom. What unfolded would humble Eleanor and teach her about worth, respect, and maybe open a heart she thought was closed forever. Would she learn before it was too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from in the comments below. And if this story touches your heart or truly resonates with your own life, make sure you're subscribed now, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you that you won't want to miss. The morning sun rose over Mercy Gulch the way it had for 100 years before, slow and steady, painting the rough wooden storefronts in shades of amber and gold. The town sat in a valley between two ridges of pine-covered hills, close enough to the railroad to matter, but far enough from the cities to keep its own character. It was the kind of place where a man's word still meant something, where neighbors knew each other's business, but mostly kept their opinions to themselves, and where the past hung around like morning fog, never quite burning off completely. Jesse Cole had been up since before dawn, the way he'd been every day for the past 40 years. His small cabin sat on 5 acres about 2 miles outside town, nestled against a stand of cottonwoods that gave shade in summer and broke the wind in winter. It wasn't much: a bedroom, a kitchen that served as a living room, and a porch that sagged just enough to make coffee cups slide toward the rail if you weren't careful. But it was his, paid for with cash earned by his own hands, and that meant something. He stood now in the doorway of his small barn, watching Clementine nose through her morning hay. She was a donkey of indeterminate age. Jesse guessed somewhere around 20, with a coat the color of dust and a mane that stuck up in every direction no matter how much he brushed it. Her ears were too long, her legs too short, and she had a stubborn streak that could try the patience of a saint. But her eyes were bright and intelligent, and in the 15 years she'd been with Jesse, she'd never once let him down when it mattered. He'd found her at an auction over in Silverton, half-starved and mean from neglect. The auctioneer couldn't give her away. Jesse was there looking at a decent mare he couldn't afford when he saw them lead Clementine out. She tried to bite the handler, kicked at the fence, and brayed loud enough to wake the dead. Everyone laughed. Jesse saw something different. He saw an animal that hadn't given up, that still had fight despite everything. He'd bought her for $7. The first 6 months were difficult. She wouldn't let him touch her without trying to bite or kick. She'd break out of any pen he built. She'd refuse to move when he needed her to, then bolt at the worst possible moment. Doc Henderson, who'd been his friend since childhood, told him he was wasting his time. But Jesse had patience and time and a stubborn streak of his own. He never hit her, never raised his voice beyond what was necessary. He just kept showing up, kept being consistent, kept treating her with respect even when she gave him none in return. The day she finally came to him willingly, nuzzling his pocket for the apple she knew he carried, was one of the proudest of his life. Now, 15 years later, they understood each other in the way that only comes from time and trust. She knew his moods from the way he walked. He knew hers from the set of her ears. They worked together on the small tasks that filled his days, hauling supplies, clearing brush, making the occasional trip into town. She wasn't fast and she wasn't pretty, but she was sure-footed on rough ground, strong enough to pull twice her weight, and smart enough to solve problems that would baffle a horse. Jesse ran his hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her coat. "Another day, old girl," he said quietly. She snorted and went back to her hay, unimpressed with his philosophizing. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, its silver case worn smooth by 3 generations of handling. The watch hadn't worked in 20 years, but Jesse carried it every day. His grandfather had given it to him when Jesse was 10, shortly before the old man died. "Time stops for all of us eventually," his grandfather had said. "What matters is what we do while it's still running." Jesse had owned a ranch once. A real one, 800 acres of good grazing land, 100 head of cattle. A house big enough for the family he'd hoped to have. That was 30 years ago, before the drought that lasted 3 summers and turned his green pastures to dust. He'd lost it all, the land, the cattle, the future he'd imagined. Most men in his position turned bitter or broken. Jesse had made a different choice. He'd walked away with his dignity intact and started over. Now he worked as a ranch hand for whoever needed help, lived simply, wanted little. The past didn't haunt him because he'd made peace with it. The future didn't worry him because he'd learned that worrying never changed tomorrow, only ruined today. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and began the small tasks that structured his mornings. Feed Clementine, check the fence line, split enough wood for the evening fire. Simple work but honest, the kind that left a man tired in body but easy in mind. On the other side of Mercy Gulch, in a house 3 times the size of any other in the valley, Eleanor Blackstone was also beginning her day. Though in a manner very different from Jesse's quiet routine, her bedroom overlooked the valley, with windows that caught the morning light and a view that stretched for miles. The furniture was dark walnut imported from back east. The rugs were Persian, and the walls were covered with paintings in gilded frames. It was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, perfectly arranged, carefully maintained, and somehow cold despite all its warmth of color. Eleanor stood before her mirror, pinning her silver hair into the neat bun she wore every day. She would turn 58 next month, though she told most people she was 55. Her face showed the years, lines around her eyes, softness beneath her jaw. But she held herself with the kind of rigid posture that comes from decades of being watched and judged. She'd been a Blackstone for 32 years, ever since she'd married Thomas Blackstone at 26. His family had owned the Blackstone Ranch for 2 generations, the largest spread in 3 counties. Thomas had been handsome, successful, and utterly sure of himself in everything he did. He'd chosen Eleanor from among several possibilities because, as he'd told her on their wedding night, she had the bearing of someone who understood position. She'd loved him in the way that a woman can love a man who seems larger than life. But love had gradually given way to something else, respect mixed with fear, admiration mixed with resentment. Thomas demanded perfection. The house had to be perfect. Her appearance had to be perfect. Their standing in the community had to be perfect. He won every competition he entered, hired only the best ranch hands, bought only the finest horses. He measured worth in ribbons and trophies, in the envy of other men, in being acknowledged as the best. When he died 6 years ago, a heart attack while breaking a new stallion, Eleanor had grieved genuinely. But beneath the grief was something else she didn't like to acknowledge, a sense of relief. For 32 years, she'd lived in his shadow, following his standards, maintaining his vision. She'd never questioned whether she agreed with those standards. She'd simply accepted them as truth. After his death, she'd continued in the same manner. The ranch ran exactly as Thomas would have run it. The house remained exactly as he'd arranged it. She bought the finest horses, hired the best hands, and maintained her position as the valley's most successful rancher. She told herself she was honoring his memory, but on the rare occasions when she was honest with herself, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, she wondered if she was honoring him or hiding behind him. She was lonely. That was the truth she wouldn't speak aloud. The house was too big, too quiet. Her ranch hands were employees, not friends. The women in town treated her with deference but not warmth. She'd built walls so high and so thick that no one could get through them anymore. And now she was trapped inside, alone. Tom Grayson, her ranch foreman, was the closest thing she had to a friend, though their relationship was complicated by the fact that he worked for her. He'd been with the ranch for 20 years, knew its rhythms better than anyone, and wasn't afraid to voice his opinions when he thought she was making a mistake. She valued that, even when it irritated her. This morning, he was waiting for her on the front porch when she came down for breakfast. He stood when he saw her, hat in hand, always respectful of the formalities, even though she'd told him 100 times it wasn't necessary. "Morning, Mrs. Blackstone," he said. He was in his early 50s, weathered by sun and wind, with the kind of calm competence that comes from doing a job well for a long time. "Tom," she nodded. "Is there a problem?" "No, ma'am. Just wanted to remind you about the Stockman's Challenge next week. You mentioned wanting Sterling to enter. Sterling was her pride, a black stallion with perfect bloodlines, trained by the best handler in the territory. She'd paid more for that horse than some men made in 5 years. He was fast, strong, beautiful, and utterly obedient. The kind of horse that won competitions. "Of course," she said. "Sterling will compete. I expect he'll take the cup easily." Tom shifted his weight, a tell she'd learned to recognize. It meant he wanted to say something she wouldn't like. "What is it?" she asked. "Jesse Cole registered his donkey yesterday." Eleanor paused, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Jesse Cole. The ranch hand who lives in that shack off Canyon Road. He's got a decent cabin, Mom. And he's a good worker. He has a donkey," Eleanor said, her voice flat with disbelief. "He's entering a donkey in the Stockman's Challenge." "Yes, ma'am. Clementine, he calls her." Eleanor set her cup down with enough force to rattle the saucer. "That's absurd. The Stockman's Challenge is a serious competition. It tests a rancher's skill, their animal's capabilities, their understanding of the work. It's not a circus. The rules don't specify horses," Tom said carefully. "Any working animal qualifies. Rules." Eleanor's lips thinned. "The spirit of the rules is clear. This is about real ranching, real animals, not some pathetic creature that should be pulling a plow." Tom said nothing, which was his way of disagreeing without openly contradicting her. Eleanor stood, breakfast forgotten. "I suppose the whole town is laughing about this. Some folks think it's interesting. Jesse's well-liked. People are curious to see what happens." "Interesting." Eleanor repeated the word like it tasted bad. "What's interesting is that a man would humiliate himself and his animal in public rather than accept his proper place. Real men ride real horses, Tom. They don't make spectacles of themselves with stubborn donkeys that can barely pull a cart." She swept into the house before Tom could respond, but his expression stayed with her. He'd looked at her with something uncomfortably close to disappointment. She tried to shake it off as she went about her day, but the thought of Jesse Cole and his donkey kept returning. The Stockman's Challenge had been her late husband's favorite event. He'd won it 6 times. Having some nobody enter with a donkey felt like an insult to Thomas's memory, to everything the competition represented. By evening, Eleanor had worked herself into a state of righteous indignation. She'd spent the day riding Sterling through the ranch, putting him through his paces, reminding herself of his superiority. He was magnificent, powerful, responsive, trained to perfection. Next to him, Jesse Cole's donkey would look like exactly what it was, a stubborn, ugly, worthless animal owned by a man who'd failed at everything that mattered. She didn't notice, or chose not to notice, that as she rode Sterling harder and harder, testing his limits, the stallion's eyes showed white around the edges. She didn't notice how Tom watched with concern as she pushed the horse beyond what was reasonable for a training session. She didn't notice how the other ranch hands exchanged glances when she finally dismounted. Flushed with exertion and satisfaction, all she noticed was that Sterling was perfect, that she was maintaining the standards Thomas had set, and that next week she would prove once and for all the difference between real quality and pathetic pretense. In his small cabin, unaware of Eleanor's thoughts, Jesse sat on his porch as the sun went down. Clementine stood in her corral nearby, ears forward, watching the hills. Doc Henderson had stopped by that afternoon with coffee and conversation, the way he did a few times a week. They talked about the challenge, about Jesse's chances, about whether entering was wise or foolish. "You know people will laugh," Doc had said. "Let them," Jesse replied. "Clementine and I know what we can do. That's enough. Eleanor Blackstone's going to take this personally. That's her choice. I'm not entering to spite her or anyone else. I'm entering because the challenge tests the things that matter: partnership, trust, wisdom. Clementine and I have those things. Whether we win doesn't change that." Doc had smiled. "You're a better man than most, Jesse Cole." "No, just an older one." I've had time to learn what matters and what doesn't. Now alone in the quiet evening, Jesse thought about the week ahead. He wasn't worried about the competition itself. He and Clementine had worked together long enough that he trusted her judgment as much as his own. But he was aware that entering would draw attention he normally avoided, would put him in conflict with people like Eleanor Blackstone, who measured worth by appearances. Still, something in him felt this was important. Not for himself, but for what it represented. Too many people in Mercy Gulch and in the world beyond judged value by surface shine rather than substance. Too many dismissed the quiet, the humble, the modest as worthless. Maybe it was time someone reminded them that worth runs deeper than appearances. He stood, stretched, and headed inside. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, the slow march toward a confrontation he hadn't sought but wouldn't avoid. The worn saddle blanket hung on his porch rail, faded and patched in a dozen places. Eleanor Blackstone would never use such a thing. It wasn't perfect enough. But it was honest, it did its job, and it carried the marks of years of faithful service. Sometimes, Jesse thought, that was the best thing you could say about anything. 3 days before the challenge, Jesse needed supplies from town. He saddled Clementine, though saddle wasn't quite the right word for the simple pad and blanket arrangement he used, and started the 2-mile ride into Mercy Gulch. The morning was clear and cool, the kind that promised heat by afternoon. Clementine moved at her own pace, which was steady but not fast, and Jesse didn't hurry her. They'd get there when they got there. Main Street was busier than usual. The Stockman's Challenge always drew visitors from neighboring valleys, and vendors were setting up early to take advantage of the crowds. Jesse tied Clementine to the rail outside Martha Quinn's general store and went inside, nodding to the folks he passed. Most nodded back. A few looked away. That was normal. He'd never been part of the inner circle of Mercy Gulch society, and he didn't expect to be. Martha was behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She'd run the store for 40 years, knew everyone's business, and had opinions about all of it. "Jesse," she said when she saw him. "Heard you entered the challenge." "That's right." "With Clementine." "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Good, about time someone shook things up around here. What do you need?" He gave her his short list: flour, coffee, salt, a few other basics. While she gathered the items, several other customers came in, and Jesse heard the whispers start. Not unkind, necessarily, but amused, curious. He didn't mind. People were entitled to their thoughts. He was loading his supplies into Clementine's saddlebags when the sound of hooves on hard-packed dirt made him turn. Eleanor Blackstone rode into town on Sterling, and she didn't ride alone. Tom Grayson and 2 other ranch hands flanked her, a procession meant to be seen. Sterling was groomed to perfection, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian. Eleanor sat straight in an expensive saddle, her riding clothes tailored and spotless. They stopped directly in front of the general store, and Eleanor dismounted with practiced grace. She handed Sterling's reins to one of her men and turned toward the store entrance. That's when she saw Jesse and Clementine. She stopped. For a long moment she simply stared. Then something shifted in her expression, a hardening around the eyes, a tightening of the mouth. She walked toward him with deliberate steps, and Jesse knew what was coming. He'd seen that look before on people who needed to prove something. "Jesse Cole," she said, her voice loud enough to carry. Several people on the street stopped to watch. "Mrs. Blackstone," he touched the brim of his hat respectfully, "I understand you've entered the Stockman's Challenge." "Yes." "Ma'am," with that, she gestured dismissively at Clementine, who was standing peacefully, paying no attention to the drama. "With Clementine?" "Yes." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and cold. "Surely you're joking." "No, ma'am. We're entered and paid up. The Stockman's Challenge is a serious competition, Mr. Cole. It tests real ranching skills, real horsemanship, real capabilities. It's not a sideshow for people seeking attention." Jesse felt the eyes of the town on him. He kept his voice level, his manner calm. "I'm not seeking attention, Mrs. Blackstone. I'm entering a competition I'm qualified for." "Qualified?" Eleanor's voice dripped with contempt. "That creature is a donkey." A stubborn, ugly beast of burden, suitable for pulling carts, not for competing with real horses in real tests of skill. Real men ride real horses, Jesse Cole. That animal is an embarrassment. The words hung in the air. Jesse felt a flare of anger, not for himself, but for Clementine. Insult him all she wanted, but the donkey had done nothing to earn such scorn. Clementine's been a good and faithful companion for 15 years, he said quietly. She's smart, strong, and sure-footed. Those seem like reasonable qualities for a stockman's challenge. She's worthless, Eleanor snapped, and you're making a fool of yourself. But I suppose that's nothing new for a man who couldn't even hold onto a ranch when he had one. The words were meant to wound, and they found their mark. A few gasps came from the watching crowd. Even Tom Grayson looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight but saying nothing. Jesse took a breath. He could feel his heart beating hard, feel the old shame trying to surface. He'd lost his ranch 30 years ago, but apparently in Eleanor Blackstone's eyes, that failure defined him forever. She saw him as a man who'd failed and therefore had no right to compete with his betters. But 30 years had taught him something. Other people's opinions of him didn't have to become his opinion of himself. He'd made peace with his past. He knew his worth, and more importantly, he knew Clementine's worth. No amount of mockery could change that. "I'm sorry you feel that way, ma'am," he said. "But Clementine and I are still entered. We'll compete to the best of our ability and let the results speak for themselves." "The results," Eleanor said, her voice laced with scorn, "will be exactly what everyone expects. Your donkey will fail at every task. You'll be humiliated in front of the entire valley, and perhaps then you'll learn to know your place." She turned to face the crowd that had gathered. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. There's a reason some people succeed and others don't. There's a reason some of us ride fine horses and others make do with stubborn pack animals. Quality matters. Breeding matters. Standards matter." She swept into the store without another word, leaving Jesse standing with Clementine on the dusty street. The crowd began to disperse, some looking embarrassed, others excited by the confrontation they'd witnessed. Martha Quinn appeared in the doorway, her face tight with anger. "That woman," she said quietly, "has forgotten where she came from. She wasn't born a Blackstone, and her heirs would be laughable if they weren't so cruel." "It's all right," Jesse said. "It's not all right. You're a good man, Jesse Cole, and Clementine's a fine animal. Don't let her poison make you doubt that." "I don't doubt it," and he didn't. What he felt wasn't doubt, it was a deep sadness that someone could be so blinded by pride that they couldn't see value unless it came. Wrapped in expensive trappings, he finished loading his supplies and was preparing to leave when Doc Henderson rode up. He'd clearly heard about the confrontation. News traveled fast in Mercy Gulch, and his weathered face was serious. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine. Eleanor was out of line." "She's afraid," Jesse said. "Afraid?" "Eleanor Blackstone. Afraid that if I do well, it'll challenge everything she believes about worth and value. She's built her whole life on the idea that expensive things are better things, that appearance equals substance. If Clementine proves otherwise, what does that say about the foundation she's standing on?" Doc considered this. "You're too generous. Most men would be angry. I've been angry. It doesn't help anything. Anger just clouds your judgment and makes you act in ways you regret later. So what will you do?" Jesse looked at Clementine, who was patiently waiting for him to finish his conversation so they could head home. "What I plan to do, enter the challenge, do my best. Show people that worth isn't about appearances. It won't be easy. Eleanor's got the whole town watching now. If you fail, she'll make sure everyone knows it. And if I succeed—" Doc smiled slowly. "Then Eleanor Blackstone is in for the surprise of her life." Jesse climbed onto Clementine's back, settling into the familiar comfort of her steady presence. "We'll see what happens. Either way, I'll know I stood up for what I believe in. That's worth more than any trophy." As they rode out of town, Jesse could feel the weight of what had happened. The confrontation with Eleanor had changed things. What had been a simple decision to enter a competition was now something more, a public challenge. A clash of philosophies, a test not just of skill but of principles. but as Clementine carried him home, her steps sure and steady, he felt no regret. Some things were worth defending, worth proving. Dignity, respect, the value of quiet faithfulness over flashy appearance. If entering this challenge helped even one person see past surfaces to substance, it would be worth whatever humiliation Eleanor Blackstone tried to heap upon him. That evening, as the sun set and painted the hills gold and crimson, Jesse sat on his porch with Clementine standing nearby. He pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, its broken mechanism a reminder that time stops for everyone. Eventually, "Well, girl," he said quietly, "I reckon we've gone and made things interesting." Clementine flicked her ears, but didn't move. Content in the cooling air. In her grand house across the valley, Eleanor Blackstone stood in her late husband's study, looking at the gleaming trophy he'd won at the Stockman's Challenge 20 years ago. The silver was polished to perfection, the engraving still sharp and clear. Thomas Blackstone, champion. She ran her fingers over the letters, feeling the raised metal beneath her touch. She'd defended his legacy today. She'd put that presumptuous ranch hand in his place, reminded him and everyone else of the natural order of things. Quality animals, quality riders, quality results. That's how it had always been. That's how it should remain. So why did Tom Grayson's expression keep appearing in her mind? That look of disappointment, as if she'd failed some test she didn't know she was taking. She pushed the thought away. She'd done the right thing. Someone had to maintain standards. Someone had to remember that not everything was equal, that some things and some people were simply better than others. Sterling was waiting in his stall, perfect and powerful. Next week he would prove her right. He would demonstrate the difference between a real horse and a pathetic donkey, between a real rancher and a failed one she was absolutely certain of. She had to be. The days leading up to the challenge took on a different rhythm for Jesse. Not because he changed his routine significantly, but because his actions now carried weight beyond themselves. When he worked with Clementine in the small corral behind his cabin, he was aware that this wasn't just daily work anymore. It was preparation. Every obstacle they practiced mattered. Every test of communication between them counted toward something larger. The morning after his confrontation with Eleanor, Jesse woke before dawn and found Clementine already alert in her shelter, ears forward as if she'd been waiting for him. He brought her morning grain and stood watching her eat, thinking about the 15 years they'd shared. He'd been 43 when he bought her, already worn down by years of rebuilding his life after losing everything. The drought that took his ranch had lasted 3 years. 3 years of watching the grass die, watching his cattle starve or get sold off for pennies, watching his hopes turn to dust. By the end, he'd owed more than the land was worth. The bank had taken it all, and he'd walked away with nothing but what he could carry and the clothes on his back. Those first years after had been dark. He'd worked wherever he could, saved what little he earned, lived in boarding houses and line shacks. He'd thought about leaving the valley, starting fresh somewhere else, where people didn't know him as the man who'd failed. But something kept him here, stubbornness, maybe, or pride, or just the simple fact that this was home. Failure or not, then he'd seen Clementine at that auction, half-starved and mean and fighting every step of the way. Something in her resistance had spoken to him. She hadn't given up, neither would he. Training her had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. Not physically hard, though she'd kicked him more times than he could count, but hard in the way that anything worthwhile is hard. It required patience he didn't know he had. It required consistency when he wanted to quit. It required him to put aside his ego and his frustration and simply show up day after day, offering her kindness even when she gave him nothing but hostility in return. The day she'd finally walked up to him willingly, nuzzling his pocket for the apple she'd come to expect, he'd felt something shift inside himself. If a mistreated donkey could learn to trust again, maybe he could too. If she could let go of her anger and defensiveness, maybe he could let go of his shame and bitterness. She'd saved him as much as he'd saved her. That was the truth of it. Now, 15 years later, their partnership was so natural it seemed like they'd always been together. He could read her moods from the position of her ears, the way she held her weight. She knew his voice's every nuance, could tell from his tone whether he was asking or commanding, suggesting or insisting. They worked together with the kind of understanding that came from time and trust, the two things that couldn't be bought or forced. He led her to the small obstacle course he'd set up. Nothing fancy, just some poles to navigate, a narrow path between two barrels, a small incline with loose rocks. Standard stuff for any working ranch, the kind of terrain and challenges they'd handled together hundreds of times. But now he watched with new eyes, assessing her performance the way a judge might. Clementine moved through the course with careful deliberation. She wasn't fast. Eleanor's stallion would cover the same ground in half the time. But she was sure-footed, testing each step before committing her weight, choosing her path with intelligence rather than just following commands. When she came to the loose rocks on the incline, she paused, assessed, then picked her way up using a slightly different route than Jessie had intended. It was the better choice. The rocks where he'd planned to go shifted under her first step. She'd noticed what he'd missed. "Smart girl," he said quietly, and she flicked an ear back to acknowledge him. That was the thing Eleanor Blackstone didn't understand. She thought the challenge was about dominance, about the rider's skill in controlling the animal. But the real test, the one that mattered, was about partnership. It was about two beings working together, each bringing their strengths, trusting each other's judgment. Doc Henderson stopped by that afternoon, as Jessie knew he would. His friend had a way of showing up when Jessie was working through something difficult. Offering conversation without pressing, just being present. "Looking good," Doc said, watching Clementine navigate the obstacles. "She's got a good head on her shoulders. Always has. I just have to not get in her way." "That's wisdom right there." Doc settled onto a fence rail, his weathered hands resting easy. "Most men think control is strength. Takes a wise man to know when to trust and when to guide." They watched Clementine in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Jessie said, "Did I make a mistake entering this thing?" "Why do you ask?" "The whole town's watching now. If we fail, Eleanor gets to be right about everything. If we succeed, she'll find a way to dismiss it. Either way, there's going to be talk. There's always talk." "That's what people do." Doc paused. "Question is, why did you enter? If you entered to prove something to Eleanor or the town, then yes, it was a mistake. But if you entered for your own reasons, then what anyone else thinks doesn't matter much." Jessie considered this. "I entered because Clementine deserves to be seen for what she is. Not what she looks like, but what she can do. What she's worth. Then you already know if it was a mistake or not." "I suppose I do." Doc climbed down from the fence, preparing to leave. "Jessie, can I tell you something?" "Always. What you and Clementine have, that partnership, that trust, most people spend their whole lives looking for that and never find it. Not with animals, not with other people. You've got something rare. Whether you win or lose next week doesn't change that. Don't let Eleanor Blackstone or anyone else make you forget it." After Doc left, Jessie stood in the corral with Clementine as the afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwoods. He ran his hand along her neck, feeling the familiar coarseness of her coat, the warmth of her living presence. She leaned into his touch, a small gesture that meant everything. "We're going to be all right, girl," he said. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Across the valley, Eleanor was putting Sterling through his paces with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Tom Grayson watched from the fence, his expression growing more concerned with each passing minute. The stallion was magnificent. There was no denying it. Fast, powerful, responsive to Eleanor's every command. But Tom saw what Eleanor seemed blind to. The horse was being pushed too hard. His coat was slicked with sweat despite the cooling afternoon. His eyes showed white. He was obeying not from partnership, but from training so intense it bordered on fear. "Mrs. Blackstone," Tom called out. "Maybe that's enough for today. One more run through the obstacles," Eleanor called back. "He's tired. He's fine." "Champions don't quit because they're tired." Tom watched as Eleanor pushed Sterling through another circuit. The horse complied, but his movements were mechanical, his spirit dampened by exhaustion. When she finally dismounted, Tom approached with a grain bucket and began walking Sterling to cool him down. "You're working him too hard," Tom said carefully. "I'm preparing him properly. There's a difference, is there?" Tom met her eyes. "Seems to me you're trying to prove something." "Of course I'm trying to prove something. I'm trying to prove that quality and breeding matter. That there's a reason we invest in the best animals, the best training, the best equipment. And who are you proving it to? The town or yourself?" Eleanor's eyes flashed. "That's enough, Tom." "Yes, Mom." He touched his hat and led Sterling away. But the question hung in the air between them. Eleanor stood alone in the training ring, watching her foreman tend to her exhausted horse. For just a moment she allowed herself to see what Tom saw, a tired animal being pushed beyond reasonable limits, a beautiful creature being used to prove a point rather than partnered with for mutual success. But the moment passed. She couldn't afford doubt. Next week, Sterling would compete against that ridiculous donkey, and he would win. He had to win, because if he didn't, then everything she believed, everything she'd built her life on, was wrong, and that was unthinkable. She walked back to the house, her boots striking the ground with purposeful force. In her husband's study, the championship trophy gleamed in the fading light. Thomas had known the difference between winners and losers. He'd known that some things and some people were simply better than others. She would prove him right. She had to. With 3 days left before the challenge, Mercy Gulch hummed with anticipation. The confrontation between Eleanor and Jessie had become the talk of every porch, every store counter, every gathering of men outside the saloon. People took sides, made predictions, placed quiet bets on outcomes. The annual Stockman's Challenge was always popular, but this year it had become something more, a referendum on values. A test of competing philosophies about worth and dignity. Martha Quinn heard all the talk. From her position behind the counter at the general store, she was privy to every conversation, every opinion. Most people, she noticed, were careful not to declare their allegiances too openly. Eleanor Blackstone was powerful, wealthy, influential. Crossing her could have consequences. But in the quiet asides, in the whispered conversations, when they thought no one was listening, Martha heard sympathy for Jessie. "That poor man," Mrs. Henderson said while buying flour. "Eleanor had no call to speak to him that way. She's always been proud," another woman replied. "But this is something different. It's like she's afraid." "Afraid of what? A donkey? Afraid of being wrong." Martha kept her own counsel, but felt satisfaction in these small rebellions. She'd known Eleanor since the woman had first come to the valley as Thomas Blackstone's new bride, and she'd watched the gradual transformation from a somewhat shy, pleasant young woman into the rigid, status-conscious widow who now lorded over the town. Thomas had done that to her, Martha thought. He'd trained her the way he'd trained his horses, to follow, to obey, to never question his authority or judgment. In her small apartment above the store, Martha pulled out the letter she'd received from her sister back east. Her sister had lost everything in a business failure and had written asking for help. Martha had sent money without hesitation, remembering her own struggles to keep the store going after her husband's death 20 years ago. People had helped her then, quietly, without fanfare, without expecting recognition. That's what community meant. That's what Eleanor had forgotten, if she'd ever known it. Jessie spent those 3 days in steady preparation, neither rushing nor slacking. He worked with Clementine each morning and evening, but he didn't push her. They practiced the skills that would be tested: obstacle navigation, weight pulling, endurance, but more importantly, they reinforced their communication, their trust. He wanted her confident, not exhausted, ready, not broken down. In the afternoons, he took on the ranch work he'd been hired for. Sam Morrison, who owned a spread north of town, needed help with fencing. Jessie rode Clementine out each day, worked until the sun got low, then rode back. The physical labor was welcome. It kept his mind from dwelling too much on the upcoming challenge, from imagining all the ways it could go wrong. Sam watched Jessie work with quiet approval. "You're a steady hand, Jessie," he said one afternoon. "That's rare nowadays. Everyone wants quick results, immediate success. You know how to pace yourself, how to do things right rather than just fast. Learned that the hard way, Jesse replied. Used to be I wanted everything right now. Pushed too hard, wore myself out, wore out my animals too. Finally figured out that steady wins most races. Your donkey's like that too, steady. She is. That's why we work well together. Sam leaned on a fence post, considering. Eleanor Blackstone came by yesterday. Warned me not to hire you after the challenge. Said you'd be humiliated and that I'd be better off with someone who understood quality. Jesse felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice level. What did you say? Told her I'd been hiring you for 5 years and had no complaints. Told her quality of work matters more than quality of talk. Sam smiled. She didn't much care for that. But I meant it, Jesse. Whatever happens at that challenge, you've got work here as long as you want it. The kindness, unexpected and simple, meant more than Jesse could easily express. Thank you, Sam. Just the truth. Now let's finish this fence before dark. That evening, Jesse sat on his porch with his grandfather's pocket watch in his hand. The silver was warm from his body heat, the mechanism inside forever frozen at 3:17. His grandfather had given it to him with instructions to make your time count, and Jesse had tried to do that. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But he'd never stopped trying. He thought about Eleanor Blackstone, about the bitterness that drove her mockery. She'd lost her husband 6 years ago, but from what Jesse had seen, she'd lost herself long before that. She'd become what Thomas Blackstone wanted rather than who she was, and now she didn't know how to be anything else. That's what pride did. It locked you into a version of yourself that might not even be true, just to avoid admitting you'd been wrong. Meanwhile, across the valley, Eleanor sat in her late husband's study, writing in her journal. It was a leather-bound book she'd kept for years, but rarely wrote in, only when her thoughts became too heavy to carry alone. Tonight, she wrote, 3 days until the challenge. Sterling is ready. Tom says I'm pushing him too hard, but Tom doesn't understand what's at stake. This isn't just about winning a competition. It's about maintaining standards, about showing the valley that quality matters, that breeding and training and investment produce results that cannot be matched by stubbornness and luck. Jesse Cole is well liked. I've heard the whispers, seen the sympathetic looks. They think I'm cruel. They think I'm proud. Perhaps I am. But someone has to remember what Thomas taught, that excellence requires high standards, that accepting mediocrity is a slow poison that corrupts everything. I remember when Thomas first showed me how to train a horse. Consistency, he said. Firmness. Never accept less than perfection. That's how he lived, and that's the legacy I'm protecting. And yet, tonight, watching Sterling in his stall, I saw weariness in his eyes. Not physical exhaustion, though there's that too, but something deeper. He obeys me. He performs, but there's no joy in it. I compared him to Jesse Cole's donkey, that scruffy creature standing in her small corral, and felt something uncomfortable shift inside me. The donkey looked content. Sterling looked resigned. I don't know what that means. I don't want to know. Tomorrow I'll train him again, and the day after, and then we'll compete and we'll win, because that's what champions do. That's what Thomas would do, but tonight, just for tonight, I wonder if Tom is right. I wonder if I'm proving something to the town, or just trying to prove something to myself, trying to prove that the 32 years I spent following Thomas's rules, becoming what he wanted, weren't wasted, that his way was the right way, because if it wasn't, then who have I been all these years? She closed the journal and locked it in the desk drawer. Morning would come, and with it another day of preparation, another day of maintaining the standards, another day of being Eleanor Blackstone, the widow who upheld her husband's legacy without question or doubt, another day of not being whoever she might have been if she'd chosen differently. The house was too quiet. It was always too quiet now. Thomas's study, his trophy room, his carefully maintained spaces, they were all museum exhibits to a man who'd been gone for 6 years. And she was the curator, carefully preserving everything exactly as it had been, as if that preservation somehow kept him alive, kept her connected to the only identity she'd ever really had. Thomas Blackstone's wife. Tom Grayson had asked her once, about a year after Thomas died, what she wanted from her life now. She'd stared at him, genuinely confused by the question, what she wanted. The question itself seemed foreign. She'd spent 32 years wanting what Thomas wanted, following his plans, supporting his ambitions. Her own wants had been so thoroughly subsumed that she'd forgotten they existed. She stood and walked through the silent house, room after perfect room. Everything expensive, everything beautiful, everything exactly right, and all of it feeling wrong in ways she couldn't name. In his cabin, Jesse slept peacefully, Clementine safe in her shelter nearby. He dreamed of wide-open spaces, of work well done, of simple pleasures that cost nothing but meant everything. His contentment was real because it came from within, not from others' opinions or external validation. Eleanor, in her grand house, lay awake long into the night. She wanted to feel confident, to feel the certainty that had carried her through 6 years of widowhood. But doubt had crept in, unwelcome and persistent, asking questions she didn't want to answer. Morning would come. The challenge would happen. One way or another, 3 days from now, something would be settled. Eleanor told herself it would be a vindication of everything she believed. But deep down, in a place she tried not to examine too closely, she suspected it might be something else entirely. Something that terrified her far more than any competition. It might be a revelation, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. The day of the challenge dawned clear and warm. The kind of late summer morning that promised heat by afternoon. By 8 o'clock, half the valley had gathered at the competition grounds, a wide meadow east of town where the various tests had been set up. Vendors sold food and drink. Children ran between the legs of horses and adults. The air carried excitement and tension in equal measure. Jessie arrived early with Clementine, wanting to let her acclimate to the crowd before the competition began. She handled the commotion with her usual steadiness, ears forward and alert, but not nervous. He walked her around the perimeter of the grounds, letting her see the obstacles, the people, the other animals. A few folks called out encouragement. More remained silent, watching. Eleanor arrived with an entourage, Tom Grayson, 3 other ranch hands, and Sterling groomed to absolute perfection. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished stone. His tack was expensive leather with silver fittings that caught the sunlight. Eleanor herself wore riding clothes that had probably cost more than Jessie made in a year. She looked every inch the champion she intended to be. When she saw Jessie and Clementine, her expression hardened. She rode Sterling directly past them without acknowledgement, as if they were beneath notice. Tom Grayson met Jessie's eyes for a moment and gave a small nod, not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement of the awkwardness. The judges called the competitors together at 9 o'clock. Besides Jessie and Eleanor, there were 4 other entrants, all mounted on horses, all looking at Clementine with expressions ranging from amusement to concern. Jessie ignored the looks. He'd learned long ago that other people's thoughts were their own business. The head judge, a retired rancher named Samuel Cord, explained the day's tests. First would be the obstacle course through rocky terrain, a narrow, winding path over uneven ground. Second would be weight pulling up a steep incline. Third would be distance endurance across the valley and back. The final 2 tests would come tomorrow. This isn't a race, Samuel emphasized. Speed matters, but so does safety, control, and judgment. An animal that finishes fast but recklessly scores lower than one, who takes time but shows wisdom. Understood? Everyone nodded. Eleanor's jaw was set, her eyes fixed on the first obstacle course. Jessie saw Sterling shift his weight, ears back. The horse was tense, picking up his rider's anxiety. The obstacle course ran through a section of the meadow where the ground was deliberately made difficult. Loose rocks, narrow passages between boulders, a shallow stream crossing, and a steep section with unstable footing. It tested an animal's sure-footedness and a rider's ability to guide without hindering. They drew lots for order. Eleanor would go first, Jessie last. Sterling approached the course with power and confidence. Eleanor gave him his head, and the stallion charged forward, taking the first section at a near gallop. The crowd murmured approval. It was impressive to watch, pure strength and speed. But as Sterling hit the rocky section, his pace had to slow. The loose stones shifted under his hooves. He stumbled once, recovered, but his confidence was shaken. Eleanor urged him on, her voice sharp with command. Sterling obeyed, but Jessie could see the horse's hesitation. At the stream crossing, Sterling balked, not wanting to enter the water. Eleanor used her spurs, and the stallion jumped forward, splashing through clumsily. On the steep, unstable section, Sterling climbed with raw power but little finesse, sending rocks tumbling behind him. He finished in good time, but it hadn't been graceful. Tom's expression as he watched was troubled. Eleanor dismounted, flushed and triumphant, accepting congratulations from her ranch hands. The other competitors went next. 2 horses completed the course cleanly but slowly. One refused the stream crossing and was disqualified. One made it through with moderate success, splitting the difference between Eleanor's speed and the other's caution. Then it was Jesse's turn. He mounted Clementine, feeling her solid, steady presence beneath him. "Just like we practiced, girl," he murmured. "Take your time." Clementine approached the course at her normal pace, not fast but not hesitant. When she reached the rocky section, she slowed further, testing each step before committing her weight. She picked her way through with deliberate care, finding the stable stones, avoiding the loose ones. It took longer than Sterling's rush, but she never stumbled. Never hesitated once she'd chosen her path. At the stream, she stopped at the edge, assessed the depth and footing, then walked through calmly, placing each hoof with precision. On the steep, unstable section, she paused again, studying the terrain. Then she took a slightly different route than the previous animals had used, finding a line that was longer but more stable. When she reached the top, Jesse heard scattered applause. Looking back, he saw Martha Quinn and Doc Henderson standing together, both beaming. Even some of Eleanor's ranch hands looked impressed, though they tried to hide it. The judges conferred and posted scores. Eleanor's Sterling had completed the course fastest, but had lost points for instability and requiring harsh commands. Clementine had taken longer, but received high marks for steadiness and intelligence. The overall scores were close, with Sterling slightly ahead. Eleanor looked satisfied. Tom looked thoughtful. The second test came after lunch, weight pulling up a steep hill. Each animal had to pull a heavy load attached to a harness up a grade of about 30 degrees for 100 yards. The weight was the same for all competitors, regardless of the animal's size. Sterling went early this time. The stallion attacked the hill with determination, his powerful muscles bunching and straining. It was impressive to watch, pure strength and will. But halfway up, Jesse saw Sterling falter. The horse was tired from the morning's exertion and from the hard training leading up to the challenge. Eleanor urged him on with voice and spur, and Sterling complied, but his steps grew heavier, his breathing labored. He made it to the top, but he was clearly winded. Tom approached Eleanor as she dismounted. "He needs rest." "He's not fresh for the endurance test." "He's fine," Eleanor snapped. "Mrs. Blackstone, he's fine." Her voice allowed no argument. When Clementine's turn came, she approached the harness with calm acceptance. Jessie helped secure it, checking the fit carefully. The load was heavy, probably close to her own weight. But Clementine had pulled loads before. It was what she'd been bred for originally, before Jessie had rescued her from that auction. She started up the hill with steady, measured steps. No drama, no rush, just consistent effort, one step after another. She didn't have Sterling's raw power, but she had endurance and determination. Midway up, she paused briefly, catching her breath, then continued. Jessie kept the reins loose, letting her set the pace, trusting her judgment. At the top, she wasn't even breathing hard. The crowd's applause was louder this time, more genuine. People were beginning to see what Jessie had always known. That Clementine might not be impressive to look at, but she was impressive where it counted. The judges scored the test. Sterling received high marks for speed and power, but lost points for the harsh driving required and the visible exhaustion. Clementine scored well for steady performance and finishing strong. The gap narrowed. The third test was distance endurance, a 5-mile circuit across the valley and back. This would test not just the animal's stamina, but the rider's judgment in pacing. Sterling and Eleanor took off at a brisk trot that bordered on a canter. The stallion was still powerful, still responsive, but Jessie could see the weariness in his stride. Eleanor pushed hard, determined to build a lead. Clementine and Jessie started at a walk that gradually became a steady trot. Not fast, not slow, just sustainable. Jessie monitored Clementine carefully, watching for signs of fatigue. When they reached the turnaround point at the valley's far end, Sterling was already headed back, well ahead. But the stallion's head was low, his stride shortened. On the return journey, Clementine maintained her pace. Sterling began to slow visibly. Eleanor used her spurs more frequently, her voice rising with frustration. The stallion obeyed, but it was clear he was running on willpower alone, not strength. By the final stretch, Clementine was gaining ground. She wasn't faster, but she was consistent, and Sterling was fading. Eleanor saw them coming and whipped Sterling into a last surge of speed. The stallion responded. He was trained to obey above all else, but as they crossed the finish line, Sterling was stumbling, his coat dark with sweat. Clementine crossed perhaps 30 seconds later, still at the same steady pace, and looked like she could go another 5 miles. The crowd's reaction was mixed, impressed by Sterling's speed, concerned by his condition, and genuinely amazed by Clementine's performance. Eleanor dismounted quickly, trying to shield Sterling from view, but everyone could see the horse's exhaustion. Tom Grayson took Sterling's reins, his expression dark with concern. "He's done, Mrs. Blackstone. He can't compete tomorrow. He will compete tomorrow. Look at him." Tom's voice was firm. "You've pushed him past his limits. If he competes tomorrow, you risk injuring him permanently." The crowd had grown quiet, watching the confrontation. Eleanor's face was flushed, her breathing almost as labored as her horse's. For a moment, something like panic crossed her features, the realization that Tom was right, that her driving ambition had brought her to this point where she had to choose between the competition and the animal's welfare. Jessie watched from a distance, Clementine standing calmly beside him. He felt no triumph, only sadness. Eleanor had proven his point better than he ever could have, that treating an animal as a tool to serve your ego rather than as a partner led nowhere good. The judges posted the day's final scores. Overall, Clementine and Jessie were now slightly ahead. Not by much, but ahead nonetheless. Eleanor didn't stay to hear the scores. She allowed Tom to lead Sterling away, then walked to her carriage without speaking to anyone. The crowd parted for her, and in the silence that followed her departure, Jessie heard whispers. Poor Sterling. She pushed too hard. That donkey, though. Who would have thought? Martha Quinn appeared at Jessie's side. "You were right about her," she said quietly. "She's afraid, I know. That's what makes this hard. I never wanted to humiliate her. I just wanted to show that Clementine has worth. You've done that. But you've also shown Eleanor something she didn't want to see. Tomorrow's going to be interesting." Jessie nodded, but he took no pleasure in it. Tomorrow would bring the final 2 tests, and with them some kind of resolution. But the cost was becoming visible in Sterling's exhausted eyes and Eleanor's desperate pride. Sometimes winning didn't feel much like victory at all. The evening between challenge days hung over Mercy Gulch like an unfinished conversation. Jessie tended to Clementine with extra care, checking her legs for any strain, making sure she had clean water and good feed. She seemed untroubled by the day's efforts, content to munch her hay and rest in the familiar comfort of her shelter. Doc Henderson stopped by as the sun was setting, bringing a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. They sat on Jessie's porch, sipping in comfortable silence, while the hills turned purple in the fading light. "You've made your point," Doc said finally. "Everyone saw what Clementine can do. No one's laughing anymore. That's not why I entered. I know. But it's what happened anyway." Doc poured another measure into each glass. Eleanor looked broken when she left. "Tom told me Sterling's so sore he can barely move. She's facing a choice now, withdraw and admit she was wrong, or push that horse tomorrow and risk seriously harming him. What do you think she'll do?" I don't know. The Eleanor I've known for 30 years would push forward no matter what. But something's changing in her. Did you see her face when Tom confronted her? For just a moment I saw doubt. Doubt's not a bad thing. Sometimes doubt is the beginning of wisdom, and sometimes it's the beginning of desperation. Doc stood, leaving the bottle. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to test more than just animals. After Doc left, Jesse sat alone in the darkness, thinking about Eleanor Blackstone. He'd been angry at her mockery, hurt by her dismissal of Clementine. But now, having watched her push Sterling to exhaustion, having seen the panic in her eyes when Tom told her the horse was done, he felt something different. Not pity exactly, but recognition. He knew what it was like to be so invested in being right that you couldn't see when you were wrong. He'd been there himself once, pushing his cattle through that last drought summer, refusing to accept that the rain wasn't coming, that holding on was just making everything worse. He'd learned, eventually, at great cost. Now he wondered if Eleanor was reaching that same moment, the one where you either learn or break. In her grand house, Eleanor stood in Sterling's stall, watching the stallion rest. He was lying down, something he rarely did, his breathing steady, but his legs twitching occasionally in discomfort. Tom had treated him with liniment and cold water, had checked him thoroughly for serious injury. Nothing permanent, Tom said, but he needed rest. Days of rest at minimum. Eleanor knelt beside the horse, running her hand along his neck. Sterling's eye opened, watching her without moving. She saw herself reflected there, not as she wanted to be seen, but as she was. A woman who'd pushed a tired animal beyond reasonable limits because she couldn't bear to admit she might be wrong. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sterling's ear flicked, acknowledging her voice. "I'm so sorry." She stayed there for a long time, the proud widow kneeling in horsebedding, finally facing what she'd become. Thomas had taught her to value winning above all else, and she'd internalized that lesson so completely that she'd forgotten to ask whether it was true. Now, looking at Sterling's exhausted form, she had to ask, what had she won? What had all this pride and all these standards and all this insistence on quality gotten her? A tired horse, an empty house, a town that respected her position but didn't like her. 32 years of being what Thomas wanted rather than discovering who she was. And for what? Tom found her there an hour later, still sitting beside Sterling. He said nothing, just sat down next to her on the straw. "I can't compete tomorrow," Eleanor said quietly. "No, ma'am. You can't. If I withdraw, everyone will say I was wrong. That Jesse Cole and his donkey proved I was wrong. Were you?" Eleanor was silent for a long moment. "Yes," she finally said. "I was wrong about many things. That's hard to admit. It's harder to keep pretending I was right." She stood, brushing straw from her expensive riding clothes. "I need to withdraw Sterling from the competition. Will you help me tell the judges?" "Of course." "But Eleanor, he rarely used her first name, and it made her look at him." "Will you help me tell the judges?" "Of course." "But Eleanor, he rarely used her first name, and it made her look at him." "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. Your reasons are your own. No, I owe Jesse Cole an apology. A public one. He deserves that." Tom's expression softened. "That takes courage, does it?" "I think it just takes finally being tired enough of being wrong." That night, Eleanor returned to her late husband's study. She looked at his trophies, his ribbons, his carefully preserved legacy, all the things she'd been maintaining, protecting, honoring for 6 years. And she realized Thomas was gone. He'd been gone for 6 years. These trophies were just metal and wood. These memories were just echoes. She'd been living in a museum, treating her life as if it had ended when his did. She pulled out her journal and wrote one final entry. "Tomorrow, I will withdraw Sterling from the competition. I will apologize to Jesse Cole in front of everyone. I will admit I was wrong about him, about his donkey, about what matters. This terrifies me more than anything I've done in years, because if I admit I was wrong about this, I have to admit I might have been wrong about other things, about the way I've been living, about the standards I've been upholding, about who I became to please a man who is no longer here to be pleased. But Sterling's exhaustion tonight showed me something I didn't want to see. I've been as tired as he is. I've been running on fumes and willpower, performing for an audience, obeying rules I don't remember agreeing to, all because I was too afraid to stop and ask what I actually want from my life. I don't know who I am without these rules and standards. I don't know who Eleanor Blackstone is when she's not trying to be Thomas Blackstone's perfect widow. That frightens me, but living like this frightens me more. I'm 57 years old. How many years do I have left? Do I want to spend them maintaining a dead man's standards or discovering my own? Tomorrow I begin to find out. Morning came with clouds, unusual for late summer. The air felt heavier, charged with the tension of unfinished business. By 9 o'clock, the crowd had gathered again, larger than the day before. Word had spread about Sterling's condition, and people came curious about what Eleanor would do. Jessie arrived with Clementine, who seemed as calm as ever. The other remaining competitors checked in. Everyone waited for Eleanor. She arrived on foot, walking from her carriage with Tom Grayson beside her. No entourage this time. No Sterling. She wore simple clothes, her hair in its usual bun, but somehow softer. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept, but had spent the night thinking. The crowd quieted as she approached the judges' table. Samuel Cord stood to meet her, his expression neutral. "I'm withdrawing Sterling from the competition," Eleanor said, her voice clear and carrying. "He's exhausted from yesterday's tests. Competing today would risk injuring him, and I won't do that," Samuel nodded. "That's responsible, Eleanor. The challenge will continue with the remaining competitors." "Wait." Eleanor turned to face the crowd. "Before you continue, I need to say something." The silence deepened. Every eye was on her. "I owe Jesse Cole an apology." Eleanor found him in the crowd, met his eyes. "I was wrong to mock you and your donkey. I was wrong to question your worth. I was wrong to believe that expensive animals and expensive training were the only measures of quality. Yesterday proved what you've known all along. True worth isn't about appearances. It's about character, partnership, and wisdom. Your Clementine demonstrated more of those qualities than my Sterling did, and that's not Sterling's fault. It's mine. I pushed him too hard because I couldn't bear to be wrong. But I was wrong about many things." The crowd was absolutely silent. Jesse stood holding Clementine's lead, his weathered face showing surprise and something deeper, compassion. "You don't owe me an apology," Jesse said quietly. "But I accept it, and I respect you for offering it." Eleanor nodded, tears threatening but held back. "There's more. I've spent 6 years living in my late husband's shadow, following his rules, upholding his standards, believing that was the way to honor him. But I realize now I wasn't honoring him. I was hiding behind him, afraid to figure out who I am without his direction. That's no way to live." She turned back to the judges. "Please continue the challenge. Let Jesse show everyone what true partnership looks like. I'll be watching, and maybe learning something I should have learned a long time ago." She walked to the audience area and, to everyone's surprise, sat down next to Martha Quinn. Martha looked at her with wide eyes, then smiled and patted the bench beside her. "Welcome," Martha said simply. Eleanor sat, feeling exposed and vulnerable, and strangely lighter than she had in years. Tom Grayson caught her eye from across the grounds and touched his hat, a gesture of respect and approval. The fourth test was announced, the problem-solving task. Each animal had to navigate a complex puzzle course without direct commands from their rider. It tested intelligence, training, and the trust between animal and human. Jesse and Clementine went last, after watching the other competitors struggle with the indirect approach. When their turn came, Jesse gave Clementine minimal guidance, trusting her to figure out each obstacle. She moved through the course with deliberate thought, pausing at each new challenge, assessing, then solving it in her own way. Not always the way Jesse might have chosen, but always effective. The crowd watched in amazement as the scruffy donkey demonstrated intelligence that no amount of expensive training could manufacture. When she completed the course, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. Eleanor joined it, clapping with tears running freely down her face. She was applauding not just Clementine's performance, but the philosophy behind it. The patience, the trust, the recognition that true partnership meant respecting the other's wisdom. Everything she'd forgotten. Everything she needed to remember. As Jessie dismounted and embraced Clementine, praising her quietly, Eleanor saw what she'd been blind to before. This man had something she'd lost. Not success in the conventional sense, not wealth or status or ribbons, but something more valuable. Contentment, peace, the kind that comes from living according to your own values rather than someone else's standards. And watching him, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in 32 years, the stirring of possibility, the sense that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to find her own way. The final test would begin after lunch, giving the competitors time to rest and the crowd time to digest what had just happened. Eleanor's public apology had shifted something in the atmosphere of the competition. What had begun as a contest between pride and humility had become something more nuanced, a moment of transformation witnessed by an entire community. Eleanor sat with Martha Quinn at one of the vendor tables, drinking coffee that tasted better than anything served in her grand house. Around them, people talked in low voices, processing what they'd seen. Some cast sidelong glances at Eleanor, uncertain how to treat her now that she'd stepped down from her pedestal. Others simply went about their business, respecting her privacy. That was brave, Martha said quietly. What you did back there? It was overdue. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup. I've been so afraid of being wrong that I couldn't see when I was wrong. That's no way to live. No, Martha agreed. But it takes courage to change course. Most people would rather stay wrong than admit it. Eleanor thought about that. She'd spent 6 years, no 32 years, staying wrong because admitting error felt like admitting failure. Thomas had taught her that failure was shameful, that leaders never doubted themselves, never questioned their choices. She'd internalized that teaching so deeply that it had become part of her identity. But watching Jessie with Clementine, seeing their partnership built on mutual respect rather than dominance, had cracked something open inside her. The question wasn't whether she'd been wrong. The question was whether she had the courage to choose differently now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded photograph she'd been carrying for days, without quite knowing why. It was old, faded, the corners worn soft from handling. The image showed a much younger Eleanor. She couldn't have been more than 24, standing beside a chestnut mare in a simple corral. She was smiling, genuinely smiling, one hand resting on the horse's neck. The mare's head was turned toward her, ears forward, eyes soft. It was a picture of partnership, of joy, of connection. Thomas had taken the photo shortly after they'd met before they were married. She'd had her own horse then, a mare she'd trained herself with patience and kindness. She'd loved that horse, loved the work of training, loved the process of building trust. She'd been happy in a simple, uncomplicated way. After they married, Thomas had sold the mare. You're a Blackstone now, he'd said. Blackstones ride the finest horses, not common farm animals. He'd bought her a series of expensive, professionally trained horses, beautiful animals that performed perfectly, but with whom she'd never felt the connection she'd had with that simple chestnut mare. She'd accepted it. She'd accepted everything. She'd become what Thomas wanted, and in the process she'd forgotten who she'd been. Martha noticed the photograph. Who's that? Someone I used to know, Eleanor said. Someone I'd like to meet again. The lunch break ended, and the final test was announced. It was called the Wisdom Test, a name that had always seemed sentimental to Eleanor. Now she understood it differently. The test simulated a real ranch crisis. A trapped calf, represented by a weighted dummy, had to be rescued from a difficult ravine. The terrain was treacherous, steep slopes, loose rocks, narrow passages, unstable ground. Speed wasn't the goal. Safety was. The test required the animal and rider to work together, trusting each other's judgment, communicating without words, solving problems as a team. It was everything Eleanor had forgotten how to do. The remaining competitors went first. 2 completed the test adequately. One animal refused to descend into the ravine, and the rider withdrew rather than force it. The judges praised the decision. Wisdom meant knowing when not to push, when to respect the animal's assessment of danger. Then it was Jessie and Clementine's turn. The entire crowd seemed to hold its breath as they approached the ravine's edge. Jessie dismounted, spoke quietly to Clementine, then remounted. She moved to the edge and paused, her ears swiveling as she assessed the descent. Jessie sat loose in the saddle, reins nearly slack. He wasn't controlling her. He was partnering with her. Eleanor recognized the difference now, saw what she'd been missing. This wasn't about dominance or obedience. It was about two beings working toward a common goal, each bringing their strengths, each trusting the other. Clementine tested the first step down, feeling for stability. Finding it, she committed. One careful step at a time, she descended into the ravine. Jessie leaned back to help balance the weight, following her lead. When she hesitated at a section that looked unsafe, he didn't spur her forward. He waited, letting her find a different path. Eleanor's throat tightened watching them. This was what she'd had with that chestnut mare all those years ago. This was what she'd lost in her determination to meet Thomas's standards. This was what Jessie had tried to show her from the beginning, and what she'd been too proud to see. They reached the bottom of the ravine safely. Jessie dismounted, secured the calf to Clementine's harness, then remounted. The ascent would be harder, steep, loose rock, extra weight. Clementine started up, testing each step. Rock shifted beneath her hooves, and she adjusted, finding stable ground. Jessie stayed balanced, trusting her judgment. Halfway up, Clementine stopped. The crowd murmured. Had she given up? Was she stuck? But Jessie didn't move, didn't urge her on. He waited. After a long moment, Clementine backed up 2 steps, shifted direction, and took a different route. The path she chose was longer, angling across the slope rather than straight up. But it was more stable, safer. When they reached the top and emerged from the ravine, the crowd erupted in applause. Not polite, appreciative applause, genuine, enthusiastic celebration. What they'd witnessed wasn't just a successful test. It was a demonstration of wisdom, partnership, and trust that transcended the competition itself. The judges conferred briefly, then announced the results. Jessie Cole and Clementine were the winners of the Stockman's Challenge. Eleanor stood and joined the applause, tears streaming down her face now without shame. She walked toward the presentation area where Jessie was being congratulated. People parted for her, and she found herself face to face with him once again. "Congratulations," she said. "That was remarkable. You and Clementine, you showed all of us what partnership looks like." "Thank you," Jessie said simply. "That means a great deal coming from you. I have a favor to ask." Eleanor's voice wavered slightly. "Would you consider coming to my ranch? Not to work, not as an employee, but to teach me what you know. How to build that kind of partnership with an animal. How to let go of control and trust instead. I've forgotten how to do that, if I ever really knew. But I want to learn. I want to be the person I was before I learned all the wrong lessons." Jessie studied her for a moment, seeing past the expensive clothes and the proud bearing to the vulnerability beneath. "I'd be honored to help," he said. "But it's not quick, and it's not easy. It takes time and patience and a willingness to fail. I have time. I'm learning patience, and I've failed enough already that doing it a few more times doesn't frighten me anymore." Jessie smiled. "Then I'll come by tomorrow. We'll start simple. Maybe just sitting with your horses, learning to listen instead of command." "That sounds perfect." Samuel Cord approached with the challenge cup, a simple wooden cup carved from oak by the town's founder 100 years ago. It wasn't expensive or impressive, just honest and sturdy and made to last. Each year's winner had their name carved into its surface, creating a record of the valley's history. He handed it to Jessie, who accepted it with quiet dignity. "Your name goes on it permanent now," Samuel said. "Part of the valley's story. I'm honored." Jessie turned the cup in his hands, feeling the grooves where previous names had been carved. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Would you do me a favor?" "Of course. When you carve my name, add Clementine's too. This wasn't just me. It was both of us. She deserves recognition." "I'll make sure of it," Samuel promised. Eleanor stepped forward. "And Jessie, when you carve the names, would you include mine as well? Not as a winner, as someone who learned something, as someone who was wrong, but is trying to do better. I'd like to remember this day, this moment, when I finally started asking the right questions. The crowd had gone quiet again, listening. Jessie considered her request, then nodded. I think that's fitting. This competition was never just about winning. It was about what winning means, about what we value, about how we treat those who depend on us. Your name belongs there because you had the courage to change your mind. That's rarer and more valuable than any trophy. Tom Grayson appeared at Eleanor's elbow. Sterling's awake and moving around. Seems better than last night. I think he'll be fine with rest. Thank you, Tom. Eleanor's voice was thick with relief. I'll check on him when I get home. And Tom, thank you for stopping me yesterday, for having the courage to tell me what I didn't want to hear. That's what real friendship looks like. Tom's weathered face softened. You're welcome, ma'am. It's good to see you finding yourself again. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd dispersed, Eleanor remained at the grounds, talking with people she'd held at arm's length for years. Martha told her stories about the early days of her store. Doc Henderson shared memories of when Eleanor had first come to the valley as Thomas's bride, how bright and curious she'd been, how that spark had gradually dimmed. Several others approached, tentatively at first, then more warmly as they realized she was genuinely listening, genuinely present in a way she hadn't been in decades. Jessie packed up Clementine's gear slowly, giving the donkey time to rest and graze. He watched Eleanor from a distance, saw her laughing at something Martha said, saw her wiping tears as Doc hugged her, saw her accepting comfort and community she'd been denying herself for so long. What do you think, girl? He asked Clementine. Think she'll really change? Clementine snorted and went back to her grass, uninterested in human drama. You're right, Jessie said. Time will tell. But she's asking the right questions now. That's a start. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the meadow, Eleanor stood alone for a moment, holding the faded photograph of her younger self. She looked at that girl's genuine smile, at the mare's trusting expression, at the uncomplicated joy in the image. I'm coming back, she whispered to the photograph. I don't know how long it will take or what it will cost. But I'm coming back to you. To the person I was before I learned to be someone else. She folded the photograph carefully and put it back in her pocket close to her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Learning to partner rather than control, to trust rather than demand, to find her own worth rather than measuring it by others' standards. It would be hard. She would fail sometimes, but for the first time in 32 years, Eleanor Blackstone felt something like hope. And that, she realized, was worth more than all the trophies in her late husband's study. The evening after the challenge, Jessie sat on his porch with the challenge cup resting on the table beside him. The oak was smooth and warm, darkened by 100 years of handling. He ran his fingers over the carved names, generations of ranchers, some he'd known, some who died before he was born. Tomorrow, his name and Clementine's would join them, permanently etched into the valley's history. The weight of it settled on him gradually. He'd entered the competition to prove a point about worth and appearances, but he'd won something more, a kind of validation he hadn't realized he needed. For 30 years, since losing his ranch, he'd told himself that the loss didn't define him. He'd believed it mostly. But some small part of him had wondered if maybe Eleanor Blackstone was right. Maybe he was just a failed rancher, making do with what he could afford. Maybe his contentment was just resignation in disguise. Now, holding this simple wooden cup, he knew differently. He hadn't just proven Clementine's worth. He'd proven his own, not through dominance or wealth or expensive equipment, but through patience, wisdom, and partnership. The things that actually mattered. Doc Henderson arrived as the last light was fading from the sky, carrying a bottle of the good whiskey this time. Thought we should celebrate properly, he said, settling into the chair beside Jessie. They poured drinks and sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Finally, Doc said, You did something important today. Not just winning, but giving Eleanor a chance to change. She did that herself. I just showed her an alternative. Don't minimize it. You could have humiliated her, could have gloated, made her feel small. Instead, you offered grace. That takes character. Jessie considered this. I've been where she is. Not exactly, but close enough. When I lost my ranch, I had a choice. Get bitter or get better. It took me a while to choose right. If I'd had someone back then showing me a different way, someone offering understanding instead of judgment, maybe I would have figured it out sooner. So you're paying it forward. Something like that. Besides, Eleanor's not a bad person. She's just been living someone else's life for so long, she forgot she had her own. You think she'll really change? Or was today just the shock of losing, and in a week she'll go back to being who she was? Jessie took a slow sip of whiskey. I don't know. Change is hard, especially when you're changing away from something you've built your whole identity around. She'll have moments of doubt, times when it's easier to slip back into the old patterns. But I saw something in her eyes today. Recognition, maybe. She saw what her pride had cost her, not just the competition, but years of her life. That's not something you forget easily. You agreed to help her. To teach her? I did. That's going to take time, patience. She might frustrate you, probably. But Clementine frustrated me for 6 months before we started to understand each other. I've got patience, Doc smiled. You're a good man, Jessie Cole, better than most, just older. I've had more time to make mistakes and learn from them. They finished their drinks as the night deepened. After Doc left, Jessie walked out to Clementine's shelter. She was resting, comfortable and content. He sat down in the straw beside her, and she shifted to rest her head near him. Tomorrow things change, he told her. Eleanor's coming here to learn. I said yes, but now I'm wondering if I know how to teach what she needs to learn. How do you teach someone to let go? How do you teach trust to someone who spent 30 years believing control is strength? Clementine breathed steady and slow, untroubled by his doubts. You're right, Jessie said. Same way I taught you. Same way you taught me. One day at a time. One small step at a time. Show up, be consistent, and trust the process. He stayed there for a while, drawing comfort from Clementine's peaceful presence. Whatever happened with Eleanor, whatever challenges tomorrow brought, he and Clementine had each other. That partnership, built over 15 years of patience and trust, was the foundation everything else rested on. In her grand house, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She'd spent the evening in Sterling's stall, sitting with the exhausted horse, apologizing again and again for pushing him so hard. Sterling had accepted her presence with quiet resignation, as he accepted everything she demanded. That was the problem, she realized. He'd been trained to accept, to obey, to perform. But had he ever been allowed to be himself? She thought about Clementine's performance in the ravine, how the donkey had stopped, assessed, changed course on her own judgment, how Jessie had trusted that judgment without question. What would Sterling do if given that same freedom? Would he even know how? Had she and Thomas trained the independence right out of him? Around midnight, unable to rest, Eleanor went to her late husband's study. She looked at the trophies and ribbons, the photographs of Thomas on various champion horses, the newspaper clippings celebrating his victories. This room had been her shrine, the place where she'd come to feel connected to him, to remember who they'd been together. But tonight, looking at it all, she felt something different. Not reverence, but sadness. Thomas had been her whole world, and she'd been so focused on honoring him that she'd never stopped to ask whether his way was the right way, whether his values were values she actually shared, or just values she'd adopted because loving him meant becoming what he needed. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "Tonight, I sit in Thomas's study for perhaps the last time as his curator. Tomorrow, I begin the work of becoming myself, whatever that means. I'm terrified. For 32 years, I've known exactly who I was supposed to be. Thomas Blackstone's wife, then his widow, always his standard bearer. Without that identity, who am I? Jessie says tomorrow we'll start simple, just sitting with the horses, learning to listen. It sounds easy, but I know it won't be. I've forgotten how to listen. I've forgotten how to be still. I've forgotten how to let things unfold without trying to control every outcome, but I want to remember. Not just for the horses, but for myself. I want to know what it feels like to be Eleanor. Just Eleanor, not Eleanor Blackstone, not Thomas's wife, not the wealthy widow everyone fears and no one really likes. Just a woman trying to figure out who she might have been if she'd made different choices. I'm 57 years old. That feels too late for new beginnings. But it also feels like maybe the only chance I have left. Tomorrow I start. She closed the journal and looked around the study one final time. Then on impulse, she began taking down the trophies from their shelves. Not to discard them, Thomas's achievements were real and deserved recognition. But to pack them away, to turn this room from a shrine into just a room. A room that could become something else. A room that could be hers. By 2 in the morning, the shelves were empty. The trophies sat in boxes, respectfully stored, but no longer on display. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, exhausted and somehow lighter. This was her house now, her life. Her choice what to do with it. She slept fitfully. Dreams mixing memory and possibility. The young woman with the chestnut mare. The widow kneeling beside an exhausted stallion, and somewhere in between, a version of herself she'd never met, but might still become. Morning came too soon. Eleanor woke with her heart racing, doubt flooding in with the daylight. What was she doing? Jesse Cole was a ranch hand, a man who'd failed at everything that mattered. What could he possibly teach her? And what would people say when they learned she'd invited him to her ranch, asked for his help? She almost didn't go. Almost sent Tom with a message that she'd changed her mind, that yesterday's emotions had been just that, emotions, not wisdom. But as she dressed, she saw the faded photograph on her dresser. The young Eleanor with her mare. That girl wouldn't have cared what people said. That girl had followed her own heart. Eleanor wanted to be that girl again. Jesse was feeding Clementine when he heard the carriage approach. He'd half expected Eleanor not to come. Change was frightening, especially when it meant admitting you'd been wrong for decades. But there she was, arriving in a simple carriage without her usual entourage. She climbed down herself, not waiting for Tom to help her, and walked toward him with visible determination. "I'm here," she said. "And I'm terrified." "But I'm here." "That's the hard part," Jesse replied, showing up. "Everything else we can figure out together. Where do we start?" "Come meet Clementine properly. Not as a competitor or a rival, just as herself." They walked to where Clementine stood, ears forward with mild curiosity. Jesse stood back, letting Eleanor approach on her own. She moved hesitantly, then stopped a few feet away. "I don't know what to do," Eleanor admitted. "Just be present. No agenda, no goal. Just be with her." Eleanor stood there, feeling foolish and uncertain. Clementine watched her with intelligent eyes. After a long moment, Eleanor said quietly, "I'm sorry I called you worthless. I'm sorry I judged you without knowing you. You're remarkable, and I was blind." Clementine took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to snuffle at Eleanor's hand. Eleanor held still, hardly breathing. The donkey's breath was warm, her whiskers soft. After a moment, Clementine turned away, not dismissive, but simply done with the interaction, and went back to her hay. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "She accepted my apology. She acknowledged your presence," Jesse said. "That's the beginning. Now, if you're ready, let's go see Sterling. Let's see if we can help him remember who he is when someone's not demanding performance from him." They walked to Eleanor's carriage, and she directed Tom to take them to her ranch. Jesse brought Clementine along, riding her steady and calm. When they arrived at Eleanor's grand barn, pristine, expensive, perfectly maintained, the contrast with Jesse's humble setup was stark. Sterling was in his stall, still showing signs of exhaustion, but alert. When Eleanor approached, he backed away slightly, an automatic response to her presence. She stopped, hurt by his reaction. "He's afraid of disappointing you," Jesse said quietly. "Every time you come near, he expects demands, expectations, judgment if he fails to meet them. I've made him afraid of me. Not afraid exactly, but wary. He doesn't trust that you'll accept him as he is. He thinks he has to earn your approval through performance." Eleanor stood very still, processing this. "How do I fix it?" "Time, consistency, showing him over and over that you're not here to demand anything. You're just here to be with him, to know him, to let him be himself. I don't know if I know how to do that. Neither did I once. But I learned, and so can you. They spent the next hour simply sitting in Sterling's stall, not touching him, not asking anything of him, just being present. It was harder than Eleanor had imagined. Her mind kept racing, wanting to plan, to control, to make something happen. But Jesse's calm presence beside her was steadying. He didn't fill the silence with talk. He just sat, breathing, being. Gradually, Sterling relaxed. His ears came forward. He began to eat his hay, no longer watching them with tension. After a while, he took a few steps closer, investigating Jesse with his nose. "Let him come to you," Jesse murmured to Eleanor. "Don't reach for him. Let it be his choice." Eleanor sat frozen, terrified of moving wrong. Sterling sniffed at her hair, her shoulder. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed, a long, deep exhalation, and rested his head near her lap. The tears came then. Impossible to stop. Eleanor wept quietly, while her exhausted horse found some measure of peace in her presence, perhaps for the first time in years. Jesse said nothing, just let the moment unfold, let the healing begin. When they finally stood to leave, Eleanor felt wrung out, but somehow cleaner, lighter. "This is just the beginning," Jesse said. "It'll take time. There'll be setbacks. Days when you slip back into old patterns, days when you want to quit. But if you keep showing up, keep being consistent, keep choosing partnership over control, something will shift. Not just in Sterling. In you? Will you help me? Keep teaching me. For as long as you need." Eleanor looked at this weathered ranch hand, this man she'd dismissed as a failure, and saw him clearly for the first time. Saw his wisdom, his patience, his deep understanding of what mattered. Saw a man who'd lost everything but found himself, while she'd kept everything and lost herself. "Thank you," she said, "for your grace. For not making this harder than it already is. We all need grace sometimes. I needed it 30 years ago and didn't get much of it. Maybe that's why I'm able to offer it now. We learn from what we lacked." As Jesse rode Clementine back toward his cabin, Eleanor stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge. Then she returned to Sterling's stall and sat down in the straw once more, beginning the long work of rebuilding trust with her horse, with her community, and most importantly, with herself. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm Eleanor had never experienced before. Each morning Jesse arrived at her ranch just after dawn. They worked with Sterling, with Eleanor's other horses, teaching Eleanor not to train them, but to know them. Some days were frustrating. Her old habits resurfaced, her need to control, to demand results. Jesse would gently redirect her, reminding her that this wasn't about achieving outcomes. It was about building relationships. The work was harder than anything Eleanor had ever done. Harder than managing the ranch. Harder than maintaining her social position. Harder than 32 years of being Thomas Blackstone's perfect wife. Because this work required her to face herself honestly, to acknowledge every time she chose pride over humility, control over trust, appearance over substance. But slowly, something shifted. Sterling began to seek her out rather than avoid her. Her other horses showed more spirit, more personality. They were becoming individuals to her, not just beautiful animals to be displayed. And in the process, Eleanor was becoming someone too. Not Thomas's widow. Not Mercy Gulch's wealthy matron. Just Eleanor, learning to be present and real, the town noticed. Martha Quinn remarked on it one afternoon when Eleanor stopped by the general store without her usual entourage. "You look different," Martha said. "Lighter somehow." "I feel different," Eleanor admitted. "Like I've been carrying weight I didn't know was there, and I'm finally setting it down." "Jesse's been good for you." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's been teaching me." "About horses?" "About patience. About more than that, I think." Martha's eyes were kind but knowing. "You're finding yourself again. That's worth more than all the ribbons in the valley." The Challenge Cup ceremony was scheduled for that evening, a small gathering where Samuel Cord would formally carve the winner's name into the oak. Eleanor had been dreading it, expecting to feel shame, to relive her humiliation. But as she prepared to attend, she felt something unexpected: gratitude. The ceremony was held at Doc Henderson's house, his large porch accommodating the dozen or so people who'd gathered. Jessie was already there when Eleanor arrived, Clementine tied nearby, content to graze on Doc's lawn. He stood when he saw her, a gesture of respect that made her heart ache with something she couldn't quite name. "Eleanor," he said warmly, "I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it." And she meant it. Samuel Cord brought out the challenge cup, its oak surface glowing in the evening light. He'd brought his carving tools, ready to add the new names to the valley's history. The small crowd gathered around as he prepared to work. "Jessie Cole," Samuel announced, "winner of this year's Stockman's Challenge, along with his partner Clementine. And by Jessie's request, Eleanor Blackstone, for courage in learning." He began to carve, the tools making soft scraping sounds against the wood. Eleanor watched, mesmerized by the permanence of it. These names would outlast them all, would tell a story to people who hadn't yet been born. What would they make of it? What would they understand about this moment when a proud woman learned humility and a humble man showed grace? When Samuel finished, he held up the cup. 3 names carved deep and clear: Jessie Cole, Clementine, Eleanor Blackstone. "Speak something," Doc Henderson said to Jessie. "It's tradition." The winner says a few words about what the challenge meant. Jessie took the cup, running his fingers over the fresh carvings. For a long moment he was silent, gathering his thoughts. Then he spoke. "I entered this challenge to prove something about worth, that it's not measured by appearances or expensive trappings, but by character and partnership. I thought I was teaching a lesson. Turns out I was learning one too. Eleanor Blackstone showed me something I'd forgotten, that courage isn't just about being right. Sometimes the greatest courage is admitting you were wrong and choosing to change. Her name on this cup matters as much as mine, maybe more, because winning a competition is one thing. Winning back yourself is something else entirely." He turned to Eleanor, holding out the cup. "This belongs to both of us, not because we both won, because we both learned." Eleanor took the cup with trembling hands. The wood was warm, solid, real. She looked at her name carved there beside Jessie's and Clementine's, and felt something break open inside her, not breaking apart, but breaking through. All the walls she'd built, all the pride she'd wrapped around herself like armor, all the fear of being seen as she truly was. It cracked and fell away, leaving her exposed but finally free. "Thank you," she whispered. Then louder to the gathered crowd, "Thank you for witnessing this, for allowing me to fail publicly and then to try again, for not holding my pride against me forever. I spent 6 years, 32 years really, being someone I thought I should be. Jessie and Clementine showed me who I actually am, or who I could be if I chose it. I'm choosing it now. I'm choosing to be Eleanor, not Eleanor Blackstone, not Thomas's widow, not the valley's wealthiest rancher, just Eleanor, trying to live honestly, trying to build real partnerships instead of maintaining appearances, trying to be someone worthy of the grace I've been shown." Her voice broke on the last words. Martha Quinn stepped forward and embraced her, and that embrace opened the floodgates. Others came forward: Doc Henderson, Tom Grayson, even people who'd been strangers despite living in the same valley for decades. They offered hugs, gentle words, acceptance. Jessie watched from a slight distance, his weathered face showing satisfaction. This was what he'd hoped for, not humiliating Eleanor but freeing her, giving her permission to be human, to be flawed, to be real. When the crowd dispersed and only a few remained, Eleanor found Jessie standing beside Clementine. The donkey was resting, half asleep, content in the cool evening air. "Walk with me," Eleanor asked. They walked in companionable silence through Doc's property, past the house to where the land opened up toward the hills. The sunset painted everything gold and crimson, that particular light that made even ordinary things beautiful. "I want to tell you something," Eleanor said finally. "These past 3 weeks, learning from you, sitting with Sterling, finding some piece of myself I'd lost, it's been the most meaningful time of my life. More meaningful than my wedding, than any of Thomas's victories, than any of the years I spent maintaining standards and appearances. Because for the first time in decades I've been real. I've been myself." "I'm glad," Jessie said simply. "There's more." Eleanor stopped walking, turned to face him. I'm starting to feel things I haven't felt in years. Not just peace or contentment, but possibility, hope, and something else. Something I'm afraid to name because I don't know if it's real or if I'm just grateful and confusing gratitude with something deeper. Jessie met her eyes, understanding what she was trying to say. Eleanor, I know. It's too soon. We barely know each other. I'm probably just emotional from everything that's happened. But I needed to say it, to be honest, because that's what you've taught me. To be honest about what I feel, even when it's uncomfortable. Jessie was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he said, I feel it too, whatever it is. But you're right, it's soon, and you're in the middle of finding yourself. The last thing you need is to rush into something new before you've finished figuring out who you are. So what do? We keep doing what we've been doing. You keep learning, keep growing. We stay friends, partners in this work. And we see what unfolds. No pressure, no expectations, just honest presence with each other. Eleanor felt relief wash over her, mixed with a sweet ache. This was wisdom, recognizing something precious without rushing to possess it, allowing its space to grow naturally. Thank you, she said, for understanding, for not making this complicated. Everything's simpler when you stop trying to control it. They walked back to Doc's house together as night fell. Two people who'd begun as adversaries and found something neither had been looking for. The possibility of genuine connection, built not on need or loneliness, but on mutual respect and shared wisdom. Whatever came next could wait. Tonight was enough. 2 months after the challenge, autumn settled over Mercy Gulch, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust. Eleanor's transformation had become evident to everyone in the valley. She still owned the largest ranch, still had wealth and position, but she wore it differently now, lightly, without the rigid pride that had kept her isolated for so long. Her mornings with Jessie had become the anchor of her days. They worked with the horses, but they also talked about life, about loss, about the choices that shape us. Jessie shared stories about the years after losing his ranch, the darkness he'd fought through, the slow process of rebuilding not his fortune, but his sense of self. Eleanor talked about her marriage, about Thomas, about the girl she'd been before she learned to be someone else. Sterling had become a different horse, still beautiful, still capable, but now showing personality that had been suppressed under rigid training. He played in his paddock, sometimes bucking just for the joy of it. He came to Eleanor willingly, nuzzling her pocket for treats, resting his head against her shoulder in quiet moments. The relationship she'd always wanted, the kind she'd seen between Jessie and Clementine, was slowly taking shape. One cool October morning, Eleanor arrived at Jessie's cabin instead of waiting for him at her ranch. She'd never visited his home before, had been hesitant to intrude on his private space. But she'd been thinking about something all week, and she needed to talk about it somewhere neutral, away from the grand house that still carried Thomas's presence in every room. Jessie was surprised but welcoming. He made coffee, and they sat on his porch with Clementine grazing nearby. The view from his modest cabin was spectacular. Unobstructed hills, wide sky, the kind of vista that invited reflection. "This is beautiful," Eleanor said. "Peaceful. It's enough," Jessie replied. "That's what I learned after losing everything." "Enough is actually quite a lot." Eleanor held her coffee cup, gathering courage. "I need to make a decision about the ranch. Tom's been managing it well, but he's getting older, thinking about retiring. I could hire a new foreman, keep things running the way they are. Or I could do something different, something that feels more authentic to who I'm becoming. What would different look like? I've been thinking about scaling down, not selling. The ranch has been in the Blackstone family for generations, but running it differently. Fewer cattle, more focus on training horses using methods like yours. Patient, respectful methods that honor the animals. Maybe offering a place for people to learn what I'm learning. Not a fancy operation, something real." Jessie considered this. "That's a big change. What would Thomas have thought of it? He would have hated it. He'd have said I was wasting potential, lowering standards, settling for mediocrity." Eleanor paused, then said firmly, "But Thomas isn't here. I am, and I get to decide what the ranch becomes now." I get to decide what matters. Then it sounds like you've already made your decision. I'm afraid of failing, of making the wrong choice, of dishonoring Thomas's memory. Eleanor. Jesse set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. Thomas built something impressive. No one can take that away from him. But his way isn't the only way. And honoring someone doesn't mean never changing anything they created. Sometimes the greatest honor is taking what they built and making it into something that reflects who you are. What if I fail? Then you fail. I did. Lost everything I'd built. And I survived. More than survived, I found a life that makes me happy. Failure isn't the end. It's just information. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. For so long, she'd been terrified of failure because Thomas had taught her that failure was shameful, that it revealed fundamental unworthiness. But sitting here with Jesse, who'd lost everything and rebuilt himself into someone content and wise, she saw failure differently. Not as judgment, but as teacher. I'm going to do it, she said. Scale down, change focus. Build something that feels true to me. Then I'm happy for you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Clementine investigate a patch of clover. After a while, Eleanor said, "There's something else. Something I've been wanting to say for weeks." Jesse waited, patient as always. These mornings with you, they've become the best part of my days. Not just because I'm learning about horses, because I'm learning about life, about patience and presence and letting things unfold, about grace and forgiveness, about who I am when I'm not performing for anyone. She took a breath. Jesse, I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I have been for a while. I know we said we'd take things slow, that I needed time to find myself. But I think I have found myself, or at least enough of myself to know what I feel. And I feel this. I feel you. Jesse's weathered face showed a mix of emotions, surprise, warmth, something tender. He reached out and took her hand, his palm rough and warm against hers. I've been falling in love with you too, he said quietly. Watching you change, watching you find courage I'm not sure I would have found in your position. Seeing you let go of pride and choose authenticity instead. You're remarkable, Eleanor, not because of your ranch or your position, because of who you're becoming. What do we do now? We keep being honest. Keep choosing each other one day at a time. No rush, no expectations. Just see where this leads. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears. Tears of release, of possibility, of finding something precious she hadn't known she was looking for. I'd like that. Very much. Jessie stood and pulled her gently to her feet, then into an embrace. She fit against him like she'd been meant to be there, his solid presence grounding her, his steady heartbeat a comfort. They stood like that for a long time, watching the hills and the sky. Clementine grazing peacefully nearby, two people who'd started as adversaries, who'd challenged each other's most deeply held beliefs, who'd forced each other to grow in uncomfortable but necessary ways. Now standing together, not because either needed saving or completing, but because they'd found in each other something rare, genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to be fully themselves. When they finally pulled apart, Eleanor looked at Jessie with eyes that were clear and certain. Will you come to dinner tonight? At my house? Nothing fancy. Just us, talking, being together. I'd like that. Should I bring Clementine? Eleanor laughed, a sound so genuine and unguarded that it surprised her. Yes, absolutely bring Clementine. She's part of this too. She's the one who started everything. She did, didn't she? Jessie looked at the donkey with affection. Sometimes the most unlikely things change everything. As Eleanor rode back to her ranch that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in decades. She was making changes, big ones, scary ones. She was falling in love, really falling in love, not just filling a role or meeting expectations. She was becoming herself finally, at 57 years old. It wasn't too late. It was never too late. That evening, as Jessie and Clementine made their way to Eleanor's ranch for dinner, the sun was setting in spectacular fashion. Crimson and gold and purple. The kind of sunset that made you stop and stare. Grateful just to witness it, Jessie patted Clementine's neck. Well, girl, looks like we've started something we couldn't have predicted. Clementine flicked her ears forward. unimpressed with human romance, more interested in the prospect of Eleanor's superior hay. Jessie laughed. You're right. The important things haven't changed. You still get fed. You still get respected. Everything else is just details. But as they crested the hill and saw Eleanor's ranch below, lights glowing warm in the gathering dusk, Jessie knew it wasn't just details. It was life unfolding in unexpected ways, proving once again that worth wasn't where you expected to find it, and that love could bloom in the most unlikely soil. All you had to do was be willing to see it. 6 months after the stockman's challenge, Mercy Gulch looked much the same as it always had. The same dusty main street, the same weathered storefronts, the same hills rising on either side of the valley. But if you looked closer, if you paid attention to the small things, you'd notice changes. The Blackstone Ranch now had a hand-carved sign at its entrance, Blackstone Coal Partnership Ranch, where patience meets partnership. Eleanor had insisted on adding Jessie's name, and Jessie had finally agreed, though he'd argued for weeks that it wasn't necessary. Beneath the main sign, a smaller one read, Horse Training with Compassion and Respect. The ranch itself looked different too. Fewer cattle, as Eleanor had planned, but more horses, not just for show or work, but for learning. Young ranchers from across the valley came to study Eleanor and Jessie's methods, to learn the patient, respectful approach that produced not just obedient animals, but genuine partnerships. Tom Grayson hadn't retired after all. He'd stayed on, fascinated by the changes, eager to learn the new methods himself. At 53, he discovered he had much to unlearn about how to work with horses. Eleanor had made him a full partner in the operation, sharing both the work and the profits. It was working better than anyone had predicted. Martha Quinn stood in her general store one warm spring morning, watching Eleanor and Jessie ride past on their way to work with a new group of students. Eleanor on Sterling, Jessie on Clementine. The two animals walked side by side now, comfortable companions despite their obvious differences. Martha smiled, remembering the confrontation on this very street 6 months ago, Eleanor's pride. Jessie's quiet dignity, the town watching to see what would happen. Never would have predicted this, said Doc Henderson, who'd stopped in for his morning coffee. Those two together, why not? Martha asked. They're perfect for each other. Both stubborn, both smart, both brave enough to change. Eleanor's different, softer, but somehow stronger too. That's what happens when you stop using all your energy to maintain an image. You have energy left for actually living, Doc chuckled. Jessie hasn't changed much, though. Still the same steady man he's always been. That's the point, isn't it? He didn't need to change. He just needed to be seen for who he already was. In the cabin that Jessie and Eleanor now shared, they'd married quietly 2 months ago, a small ceremony with just close friends. The morning routine had settled into comfortable patterns. Eleanor woke early, no longer weighed down by the emptiness of her grand house. She'd kept the house but transformed it, turning Thomas's trophy room into a library, opening several rooms for the students who came to learn. It was full of life now, of purpose beyond preservation. She'd brought little to the cabin, some clothes, her journal, the faded photograph of her younger self with the chestnut mare. The photograph now sat on the mantel, a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd become again. Beside it was Jessie's grandfather's pocket watch, still broken, still carried every day. 2 objects that didn't work in conventional ways, but held more meaning than 1,000 functioning things. They worked together now, teaching side by side. Eleanor had a gift for it that surprised her. Patience she'd never known she possessed, empathy that had been buried under years of pride. Watching a student finally understand, seeing an animal relax into trust, gave her more satisfaction than any of Thomas's trophies ever had. One afternoon, a young ranch hand named Sarah brought her horse to work with Eleanor and Jessie. The horse was beautiful but terrified, flinching at every touch. Sarah was frustrated, near tears. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong," Sarah said. "I've tried everything." Eleanor recognized herself in that frustration, the need to fix, to control, to force an outcome. She knelt beside Sarah, gentle but direct. The question isn't what you're doing wrong. It's what your horse needs that you're not giving. Stop trying to train him. Start trying to know him. Sit with him. Be present. Let him tell you what he needs. But that could take forever. It might, or it might take less time than you think. Either way, there's no rushing trust. You can't force it. You can only create the conditions for it to grow. Jessie watched Eleanor teach, saw her wisdom flowing from hard-earned experience, and felt profound gratitude. Not just for finding love at an age when he'd stopped looking, but for witnessing transformation. For being part of someone's journey back to themselves. That evening, they sat on the cabin porch as the sun set, their evening ritual. Clementine grazed nearby, Sterling in the adjoining paddock. The two animals had become unlikely friends, the donkey's steadiness calming the stallion's remaining nervousness. "I got a letter from Sam Morrison today," Jessie said. "He wants to bring his grandson to learn from us. Says the boy's got potential but thinks horses should be dominated. We'll teach him differently. We will." Jessie took her hand. "Did you ever imagine this? 6 months ago, did you see any of this coming?" Eleanor thought back to that morning when she'd confronted Jessie on Main Street, so certain of her rightness, so blind to what mattered. "No, I couldn't have imagined it because I couldn't imagine being wrong. And I was so wrong, Jessie, about everything. You weren't wrong about everything. You were right about standards mattering. You were just wrong about what the standards should measure. Quality of character, not quality of appearance." "Exactly." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from gold to purple. Eleanor thought about the girl in the photograph, about the long circle her life had taken to arrive back at that simple joy, about all the years spent performing, maintaining, pretending, about how exhausting it had been, how relieved she was to finally stop. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For showing me another way, for being patient while I fought against it, for offering grace when I deserved judgment, for loving me even when I was difficult to love." Jessie squeezed her hand. "You were never difficult to love. You were just difficult to reach. There's a difference. Clementine's lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have her, and you, and this life we're building together." As darkness settled over the valley, lights began appearing in windows across Mercy Gulch. Each light represented a life, a story, choices made and paths taken. Eleanor thought about the challenge cup sitting in their cabin now, her name carved beside Jessie's and Clementine's, a permanent record of the day. Everything changed, but it hadn't really been that single day, had it? Change had come gradually, through small choices repeated consistently, to listen instead of command, to be present instead of controlling, to value substance over appearance, to choose authenticity over pride. In town, people still talked about the challenge, but the story had evolved in the telling. It wasn't about a rich woman losing to a poor man anymore. It was about wisdom prevailing over pride, about partnership triumphing over dominance, about having the courage to change, even when change meant admitting you'd been wrong. Most of all, it was about a stubborn donkey named Clementine who'd reminded an entire valley what worth really meant. The worn saddle blanket that had started everything faded, patched, honest, now hung in Eleanor's barn beside Sterling's expensive tack. Students asked about it sometimes. Why display something so worn out? Eleanor's answer never changed. To remember that worth isn't measured by appearance, that something can be old and patched and still be exactly what's needed, that the most valuable things are often the things we almost overlook. She'd become wise enough to know that she was talking about more than blankets. She was talking about donkeys who'd been called worthless, about ranch hands who'd been dismissed as failures, about women who'd lost themselves and found their way back, about second chances and new beginnings, and the courage to choose differently. As Jessie and Eleanor prepared for bed that night, both tired from a full day's work, both content in ways they'd never expected to be, Clementine settled into her shelter. She was 21 years old now, grey around her muzzle, moving a bit slower than she once had. But her eyes were still bright, still intelligent, still seeing what others missed. She'd started a revolution without meaning to, just by being herself, by being valued for who she was rather than what she looked like. She challenged everything a proud woman believed and changed everything in the process. Sometimes the things we judge as worthless hold more value than we'll ever know. Sometimes the smallest, most overlooked creatures teach the most important lessons. Sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the places we least expect to find it. And sometimes, in a dusty frontier town in the middle of nowhere, a stubborn old donkey saves 2 human hearts and reminds an entire community what really matters. In Mercy Gulch, they still tell the story. But now they tell it with respect, with wonder, with understanding. They tell it as a reminder that worth isn't where you think it is, that appearances deceive, and that the greatest victories aren't about winning at all. They're about becoming who you're meant to be. They're about choosing a partnership over pride. They're about learning to see value in places you'd been taught to dismiss. And they're about having the courage, no matter your age, no matter your mistakes, to choose differently, to change, to grow, to become, finally, truly yourself. The story of Jessie Cole, Eleanor Blackstone, and a donkey named Clementine had become part of the valley's fabric, passed down through generations. A story about how the most unlikely friendship can teach the deepest truths, about how it's never too late to find yourself, about how love appears in the most unexpected places when you're finally ready to see it, and about how sometimes, when a rich woman stops laughing at a poor cowboy's worthless donkey and starts really looking, really seeing, she discovers that everything she thought she knew about worth and value and what matters in life was exactly backwards. That discovery, that transformation, that journey from pride to humility to genuine